Welcome, everyone. My name is Matt Matravers. I'm the director of the Morrell Centre for Legal and Political Philosophy. Welcome to the University of York. I'm just going to say a few words to introduce the day before handing over to Joan to introduce this session, but just to offer two words of thanks. First, to the C&JB Morrell Trust, representatives of which are here. The C&JB Morrell Trust has sponsored the Morrell Centre for Legal and Political Philosophy for many, many years, and we are incredibly grateful. We literally couldn't do it without you. So thank you. Second, as ever, thank you to the Festival of Ideas team that delivers this wonderful 13 days and helps, in fact, puts today together on my behalf. So how did today come about? Well, what happens, we've done Morrell Days for the last 10 or 11 years, I think. What happens is in autumn, Joan and her team and I meet, usually in the basement of Heslington Hall, that very lovely space, and talk about what should the day be next summer. And sometimes, you know, we ponder different things. As you might imagine, last autumn, with the election of Donald Trump, the day kind of suggested itself. And we've been revising the day since then, but in effect, what we thought was, well, let's have a think about not just where we are, but in some ways, how did we get here? And so our morning session, our first session, is on polarisation and disinformation. It is perhaps the most remarkable feature, I think, of the contemporary world, a feature that I think 10 or 15 years ago, none of us would have even recognized, that roughly half the population of many states believes completely different things, including just different facts from the other half of the population. More than that, they think that the other half of the population are not just people with whom they disagree, but they think that they are traitors or betraying the nation, and they think of them as enemies. And that kind of polarization is something that I think was unfamiliar some years ago, and it's clearly deeply damaging. The second session then, which is at 1:30, they're all in this room, A New World Order. We'll look at, well, okay, so where are we? We seem to be, for those of us of a certain age, back in an era of kind of great power and great male, actually it's always male, politics, with leaders in Russia and China and the US seeming to command the global order. It's quite something when a US president flies over the top of Europe without engaging with Europe in order to sort out a problem in Europe with the president of Russia. So our second session will look at the New World Order. And then our third session will look at a pressing question that's been on the news of late because of the Defense Review, which is Europe actually safe anymore? The US is looking, let's say, unreliable as an ally, and that raises questions that haven't been raised since the end of the Second World War. So those are our three sessions. I very much hope you'll be able to join us for all of them. The Festival of Ideas is great in large part because of the great engaged audiences we have. So I look forward to seeing the same faces over the course of the day. And as I said, welcome to the University of York, and I'll hand over to the phenomenon that is Joan Concannon.
Matt, thank you very much. I don't know what to say about the phenomenon thing, so I won't. Good morning, everybody. It's fantastic to see you all. As Matt said, I'm Joan Concannon. My day job is Director of External Relations here at the university, which I usually say is the best job on campus. And partially that's because I'm also the co-founding director of York Festival of Ideas with the late and sadly lamented amazing colleague Jane Moody. So welcome to all of you this morning, and I'm very glad that you've come here. Let me introduce our incredible panel. One of the best things is dreaming up cast lists of people who do amazing things, write amazing things, and then they very kindly say, yes, I'd like to come to York to talk to your festival audience. So I'm going to start, because I've written it in a particular order, which isn't the order they're going to speak in, but let me start with Jessica Cecil, who is a leading media industry figure and an expert in the field of disinformation, currently working as a consultant to media and tech companies. In 2019, she started and led the incredible Trusted News Initiative, TNI, the world's only alliance of major international tech companies and news organizations to counter the most harmful disinformation in real time. So she's got loads of practical responses. Jessica's media industry leadership experience was honed over a 30-year career at the BBC. She was chief of staff to 4 director generals. I'm guessing that is a good dinner party conversation starter. And she has gained a track record of creating and leading global alliances, responding to the changes that technology is having on audiences' lives. Before TNI, she led a 30-partner strong initiative to get the world to learn how to code. The result was the creation, manufacture and distribution of a codable computer, the microbit. 6 million microbits have now been sold in 50 countries and are used by 25 million children from Singapore to Finland. Jessica's background is a news journalist and documentary maker. She was an international news producer and assistant editor of BBC Newsnight, and she is an Emmy nominee for the primetime TV science documentary Human Instinct. Welcome to Jessica. Dr. Chris Featherstone is rather closer to home, is an associate lecturer in the University of York's Department of Politics and International Relations. His research has an overarching focus on the role of individuals in foreign policy and how individuals influence foreign policy making and the conduct of foreign policy. Working at the intersection between international relations, US and UK foreign policy and foreign policy decision making, he's published on foreign policy analysis, US presidential foreign policy decision making, which gets more interesting by the day. His current research builds on this, focusing on UK foreign policy decision making structures, the Trump administration's foreign policy legacy, and US cyber foreign policy. Alexander Hurst, who I stalked gently on the back of a couple of articles I read in The Guardian that were really amazing, is a Paris-based writer, editor, and freelance journalist, but also a columnist for The Guardian, and an adjunct lecturer at Sciences Po, the Paris Institute of Political Studies. He holds an MSc in International Relations from the London School of Economics and an MA in International Public Policy from Sciences Po. He spent most of his childhood in a quirky, pre-gentrification inner-city neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio, before crossing the Atlantic. After a year working in Mundu, Chad, where he learned to properly peel a mango, I'm not quite sure how you improperly peel a mango, he ended up in Paris writing long-form stories and essays for various magazines. His memoir, Generation Desperation, which will be available in January 26, so we'll need to get him back, is a modern fable about money and greed. At its centre, the story of how he made and lost a 1.2 million trading meme stocks during the chaotic COVID lockdowns of 2020. Alexander became a French citizen in the summer of 2022. Aurelien Mondon is a professor of politics at the University of Bath, co-convener of the Reactionary Politics Research Network. His research focuses predominantly on the mainstreaming of reactionary politics through elite discourse. He's the author of The Mainstreaming of the Extreme Right in France and Australia, A Populist Hegemony, and co-author of Reactionary Democracy, How Racism and the Populist Far Right Became Mainstream, with Aaron Winter. He's the co-editor of After Charlie Hebdo, Terror, Racism and Free Speech, and The Ethics of Researching the Far Right. His work has appeared in various mainstream and expert outlets around the world, including CNN, The Guardian, The Independent, Libération, Newsweek, Le Soir, Mediapart, and Al Jazeera. I think we've got an expert panel here, people. So I'm going to hand over immediately. So the narrative arc is we're going to set the context, we're going to think about responses, and then we're going to think about what we need to do next, I think is broadly the thrust. I'm going to start with Chris.
Well, thank you very much for coming along, and thank you for the very nice introduction. And as Joan mentioned, in recent years, a lot of my research has focused on the Donald and how he makes decisions, how he operates, how he receives information, and what impact that has on the rest of the world. We all have to live with his decisions. And there are two responses I get whenever I mention that this is what I do. This is what I spend most of my days, especially over the summer, doing. The first is why, which is understandable. And the second is you must have so much to do. You must have so much to talk about. And actually, I think those two responses are crucial to understanding the impact that Donald Trump and his brand of politics has had on how we are all impacted by disinformation, misinformation in the modern world. The why aspect comes from a certain place of maybe revulsion or disgust or troubling thoughts on how is it that we are impacted by this brand of politics, this brand of language when it comes to our politics, when it comes to our political discourse. Right? I think this really emphasizes everyone has an opinion on Donald Trump. I will teach students who will come along to me and say, I think he's brilliant, he's hilarious, okay, he might be ending the world, but it's really entertaining to watch how he's going to go and do it. Which is worrying. But then there's the other side who think that he is the antithesis to politics. He is everything that we should fight against. He is everything that politics has to be able to resist. And I can understand that as a perspective, arguably a little bit more than the first. But I would also say it's partly this that creates some of the difficulties that we face when it comes to studying Trump. Right? He is such an anathema. He invigorates our discourse to such an extent that it means it's actually quite difficult to have a conversation about him. It's actually quite difficult to research how he does politics. But also the urge to inquire and explain everything that he does actually also further complicates this process of trying to research Donald Trump. He just does so many things that it's very difficult to understand where you would start. Do I want to look at his narrative arc, his strategy in terms of the entirety of his foreign policy? Or do I want to hyper-focus and look at his bizarre relationship with Vladimir Putin, or how he wants to try and reinvigorate US, North Korea diplomatic talks? Or do I focus on just the rubbish he says? Who knows? That's on my to-do list to pick. But it exacerbates the difficulty that we face when it comes to disinformation. Not only are we faced with a debate over what is reality, what are facts, how can we actually have a conversation with someone living in a different ecosystem to us, but also, how do I focus the debate away from the topics that maybe Donald Trump wants to talk about, onto topics where we can maybe try and propose solutions? And I think this is a key part of the starting point for understanding Donald Trump and his impact on our politics. But it's important to look at why this blizzard of events, this blizzard of announcement, policies, executive orders, why is this being trotted out? Why is this the strategy that they're choosing? And I would say it is intentionally this. It is the blizzard that is the point. We are so overwhelmed with the narrative, we are so overwhelmed with some of the bizarre rubbish that he will come out with, that we don't really know where to get our teeth into, right? And this is actually part of the strategy that they have freely referred to. They refer to it as flooding the zone. Now in our politics, it's not that the Democrats are the opposition for the Republicans. The Republican Party, and MAGA especially, don't believe that. They see the media as the opposition. The media are who they are fighting against. And so they are flooding that zone, flooding the media, so that they are overwhelmed, so that the media looks chaotic. They don't know how to deal with it. They don't know what to talk about. Do we talk about the fact that Donald Trump's trying to sell a Tesla that we're not entirely sure he actually owns? Do we talk about his ego clash, the rutting of the bulls, apparently, as we're told, between him and his former bromantic partner? Or do we look at some of the policies, the decision early this morning, late last night, to deploy the National Guard to LA, right? Whether they actually will go is an entire other debate. But it becomes very difficult to have these kind of conversations. And this, I would argue, stems from the core of Trumpism, and that is an empty core. Whereas previously we've had politicians who have had an ideological basis, an ideological frame, and from there, their strategy comes, from there, their narrative comes, everything else stems from their ideology. With Donald Trump, I would argue he has what Kasmuda refers to as a shallow populist ideology. He doesn't have an ideological frame. He has a certain number of core principles that he has thrown out and has found work very well. When he talks immigration, he can talk the language of the common man, as he refers to, of the Rust Belt, whilst never actually having really interacted with anyone from the Rust Belt prior to his 70th birthday. But it means that he can interact with them in a way that other politicians just don't. because they are trying to live in a world of reality. They are trying to deal with politics as it is, not as how they wish it might be in their mind. And so this does mean that we have a politician who lacks a particular ideological core, meaning that you cannot fight that ideological core. You cannot confront his ideas, his ideology, because there isn't really anything there. He's perfectly happy to step away from big policies when those policies get in the way of his populism. That is what matters to him most, and that's why this disinformation can come out so freely. The emphasis, the point of the blizzard, of flooding the zone, is to maintain his position, not maintain his policies. I would argue he doesn't necessarily care about his own policies. What he cares about is Donald J. Trump. And I'll leave it there.
That's got us off to a rollicking start. Aurelien.
Thank you. I've got lots of questions, but I'll keep them for later. Yeah, thank you, Joan. Thank you for the team as well, and thank you all for being here today. I'm sure many of you would like me to talk about the scandalous. Many of you would like me to talk about Trump, about like the rubbish he says, to quote you, right? To talk about Musk, to talk about fake news and so on. But what I'm going to talk about really is something a lot more mundane, and I'm going to try to stick to my notes because you gave me 7 minutes, and it's going to be hard not to digress a lot. So I'm going to talk about something really altogether more mundane. As I said, I'm going to talk about power. And in particular, I want us to reflect really in these 7 minutes and in the next hour and a half really about where power lies, right? Not just politically, but also in terms of discourse, in terms of who sets the agenda, who decides what is talked about in our societies, not just in the US, in the UK as well. I mean, we've talked a lot about the US because, again, Trump, as you said, occupies a lot of our space and our public space. But why is that so? Why do we let him? Why do we let Farage, why do we let Marine Le Pen in France and so on occupy so much space? Who decides that? Is it because they are good? Is it because they are savvy? Is it because they are popular? Or is it something altogether different that I'd like to explore in these 7 minutes, or 6 probably by now? Anyway, what I want to argue is that it is problematic to talk about misinformation and polarization as external threats, as they divert attention from the roots of the issue, which are to be found, I would argue, in our political systems and in our failing democracies in particular. And I want to look at these through 2 particular issues. The first one is seeing the resurgence of far-right politics as a binary process, or outside-in, where the extreme is banging at the door of our good mainstream politics and society. Whether it's Trump versus the Democrats, whether it's Farage versus the Conservative or Labour, or whether it's Le Pen versus Macron. This idea that there is the extreme and the mainstream, and a barrier between the two. I would argue that this ignores that the border between what is mainstream and extreme are fuzzy and have always been. And what is mainstream today was not yesterday and might not be tomorrow. You could think, for example, of the issue of abortion, which we believed had become mainstream, and as we can see in the US, no longer is in many states, right? We can see that these things that we take for granted were not always mainstream. They appeared radical at some stage. The fact that women could be in a lecture theater, for example, was not mainstream for a very long part of our societies and democracies. It is today. Whether it will be tomorrow or not is for us to decide, but I think it's important to kind of challenge this idea that the mainstream is immovable. In fact, many of the rights that today we consider as mainstream and that we hold dear, that we believe are core to our democratic institutions and our democratic fabric, were won in deeply polarizing struggles against the mainstream elite of the time, and by movements which we would today consider too radical, probably. Mainstream disinformation, through the concentration of media ownership in particular, and their close ties to politics, have always played a key part in blunting these progressive movements and in limiting the reach and the goals. In turn, this has weakened, I would argue, the main forms of resistance against the far right, and this is why we are where we are today. Meanwhile, what we have seen in the last 40 years is mainstream parties and media accepting and even embracing far-right discourse and politics as they refuse to actually tackling the many crises that our societies are facing, whether it's the rise of inequalities, the climate crisis, and the disconnect between the elite and the people. Therefore, what I would argue to conclude this first point is that creating binaries enforces the idea that our only choice is between the statu quo, which appears to be failing, at least to many people, and increasingly mimics the far right and the far right. And I would argue that this is a vicious circle, and we need to move beyond that. But you will tell me, this is what the people want. This is what we get in elections. Trump gets elected. Reform is on the rise. The Rassemblement National, whether with Marine Le Pen or Jordan Bardella, is looking very strong for the next French presidential election. Well, maybe not. And that's where I want to take you with the second issue I want to discuss. Too often, we see the resurgence of reactionary politics or far-right politics explained as a bottom-up process, the so-called populism. The rise of Trump or Le Pen or the Brexit victory have been blamed on the people and their gullibility or their authoritarian tendency. Whether they take the form of the left behind, the white working class, the red wall, or the Rust Belt, it is these voters falling for so-called populist fantasies who are seen as responsible for our plight. It is not us in this lecture theatre. It is not us as academics. It's not you as journalists, media figures, policymakers, and so on. It's the people who is to be blamed. We know better, and therefore our media, our politicians, and to some extent our academics have no choice but to embrace reactionary agendas and discourse, since that's what the people want, after all. Yet I would argue, and many of my colleagues have as well, that this is inaccurate, but it is also deeply damaging to democracy. It is inaccurate because votes for Trump and Brexit were predominantly wealthy votes, something that I can discuss more in the Q&A, unless you give me another 10 minutes, Joan? No? Okay. But really should be obvious, considering the nature of these political projects and their leaders in particular. Remember Trump and Farage in their golden elevator. It is damaging to democracy because it diverts attention away from those who have been primarily responsible for the rise of far-right politics. Let me just give you an example of how this plays out. I'm sure you've heard that immigration is a major concern for the people, meaning that our mainstream elite, whether in the media, politics, or even academia, have no choice but to discuss it endlessly and implement authoritarian measures. Again, we are told that this is what democracy requires because that's what the people want. But is it? Well, if you look at the Eurobarometer survey, which is a large survey done at the European level, when people are asked about the two main issues facing their country, immigration ranks quite high, but is rarely top. In fact, it gets to the top issue in the UK in 2016. I'm sure you know what happened in 2016. So I'm not going to go through that. What's interesting is that as soon as 2016 ends, immigration drops as a concern for people, even though immigration keeps rising sharply afterwards. So what's going on here? Already a disconnect. And yet more interesting to me is that when the same people, within seconds of the first questions about their country, are asked, according to you personally, what are the two biggest issues that you are facing at the moment, immigration is at the bottom. Instead, people talk, and this is what I'm going to say is the 10 years before COVID. So I didn't include COVID because obviously it skewed surveys with health and so on. But the 10 years pre-COVID, this is what people said. Rising prices, health, social security, financial situation of your household, pensions, unemployment, and the education system. Immigration is at the bottom. There are more people who say they have no concerns than people who say they are concerned about immigration when it's about their day-to-day lives. So how can we explain this? Well, it's complicated, obviously. I'm an academic, I'm not going to tell you it's easy, right? But the key starting point, I think, is for us to think about our political knowledge and how it is inherently mediated. No one goes to the ballot box or answers a survey as an empty, unbiased vessel. We all rely on various sources to make our political decisions. This is absolutely necessary. That's not a bad thing. This is not propaganda. This is not fake news. We need that. We need to trust mediated information. For a long time, mediated information could be found in different places. It could be religious institutions. It could be schools. It could be trade unions. It could be the media, and so on. But of course, today, we have fewer of these sources, and they are massively held in very few hands. Therefore, what I would argue, and to conclude on, is that while the threat of disinformation and the far right are pressing and very real, if we are serious about tackling them, what we need to do is to pay particular attention to where power lies and the system that have enabled them in the first place, and how discourse has become mainstream, and who had the opportunity to challenge these discourses becoming mainstream. So hopefully that made sense, and hopefully that wasn't more than 7 minutes.
Well, I think that absolutely perfectly segues onto the response. Jessica, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Joan, and thank you, everyone, for coming today. So we've heard about the harm of disinformation, and I think it's worth pointing out that the social media environment we live in creates debates that tend to be much more simplistic, polarised, and emotional. But my job, I think, on this panel is to say what is to be done. Disinformation is big and difficult, but I personally strongly believe that a single initiative or even one piece of legislation on its own is not going to solve the problem, whatever that even means. But each intervention can be a brick in a much bigger wall, and a wall that can attempt to keep out some elements of the worst of the problem. And one such brick, I hope, is the Trusted News Initiative, and I'd like to spend a couple of minutes just telling you what that is. It came about as a result of the general election in India in spring 2019. I was working at the BBC at the time, and we found that in the run-up to the elections, Facebook was carrying BBC-branded opinion polls. They were wildly inaccurate and totally fake. This type of disinformation is called imposter content, and it's pretending to be from an organisation when it is nothing of the type. And once a lie is on a platform, of course, it jumps quickly to others, and it can spread to people who might think it is true, and they then spread it further. This represented, as you can imagine, a big issue for the BBC, because people might think that they were biased and they were pushing it. But much, much more importantly, audiences are also voters, and they could conceivably choose how to vote on the basis of an opinion poll that was totally fake. What we did at the BBC is we complained to Facebook, and we went right to the back of the queue, and the queue takes several days to resolve, and by that point, the damage would be done. So all we felt we could do was put out a press release, and as you know, Joan, people may or may not notice them, but they were not going to have very much effect. And we felt it was a pretty inadequate response to a big and urgent issue. It just wasn't good enough. So that summer, we gathered together the leaders of the big tech companies, Google, Facebook as it then was, now Meta, Microsoft, Twitter as it then was, alongside some of the world's biggest news organisations, the BBC, Reuters, Agence France-Presse, the European Broadcasting Union, the Hindu and others. And we agreed two things. The first was that you could define a really small subset of disinformation that you believed was urgently really harmful, and of course you knew to be false. And the second was that once you found that, you could alert all the members to it. So we put together a very loose alliance called the TNI, and we defined that small subset of disinformation that we were concerned with, which was information that we knew to be false, of course, but which posed an immediate threat to the integrity of a democratic election or order, and an immediate threat to life. And we agreed a way of alerting members when we came across it. So the TNI was two things: identifying the type of disinformation and alerting members. So the TNI would have covered those Indian elections, but we didn't map out those specific future stories that we thought it would cover, because you simply don't know how it's going to express itself. In the time I led the TNI, up until I left the BBC a couple of years ago, we had alerts that fitted those criteria, but weren't necessarily stories that you would have predicted. In fact, we didn't predict them. So, for instance, during COVID, you will remember there were international calls to attack the 5G infrastructure. And that fitted the bill, and it wasn't because they were inaccurate. Of course they were inaccurate. But when you incite people to attack the infrastructure on which the emergency services base their response, you're putting people's lives at risk. So it has to be both inaccurate and also life-threatening. Or a tweet pretending to be from the BBC that claimed Boris Johnson, who was then ill in hospital, had actually died. It was entirely plausible and potentially highly destabilising. But it was picked up in a few minutes and it was taken down. So I guess reflecting on all of that, what are my personal learnings from that. The TNI is still the only coalition of its type in the world, and I think its longevity, relatively, relies actually on its modesty and the fact that its scope is very well defined and very limited. Despite some of its opponents claiming it is a shadowy cabal of big tech and big media aimed at closing down free speech, it's nothing of the sort. And nor is it policing the whole internet, which would be completely impossible. It's going after low volume, high impact, closely defined disinformation. And for me, that tells us a couple of things. First, you can define content that you are more concerned about. And in the jargon, it is usually inauthentic, i.e. pretending to be from someone it isn't, and it is interfering in things that really matter, like elections. And there are lots of difficult cases, marginal calls where freedom of speech butts up against perceived harms. But the existence of those finely balanced cases shouldn't mean we are paralysed and unable to do anything about things that are not finely balanced. We know perfectly well they're incredibly wrong. Secondly, once you define what specific kind of problem you're trying to tackle and you draw it quite closely, it's much, much easier to draw together a coalition of the like-minded. And finally, as I said at the beginning, tackling some of the issues of disinformation involves a series of actions or interventions, not just one. So how do we go about building the wall, and what are the bricks we need to think about? Well, obviously, the environment is really tough right now. We haven't talked about AI threatening to get between news publishers and their audiences, and so knowing that you are using a trusted news brand is potentially set to get much harder. And big tech looks like, for the moment, it has the backing of the Trump administration, and that means US government has been saying that regulation of its tech companies could cost other countries trade deals and prosperity. But the blocks of intervention to tackle disinformation are there, and they're what they have always been. First of all, regulation. Regulation sets the culture, and look at Brazil. When there was a standoff between Elon Musk, owner of Twitter X, and Brazil's Supreme Court last year, the Supreme Court said that X accounts were spreading disinformation. Elon Musk cried censorship. But faced with being banned from the Brazilian market, he backed down and he got rid of those accounts. Platforms are incredibly powerful, but governments set the rules. Then there is self-regulation and coalitions like the TNI. And as I say, I see it as one of several and many, I hope, and I hope that it can serve as a proof of concept of what can be built on. And of course, there is education. There is media education of citizens. We can obviously talk about it. It's a massive topic. It's incredibly important. But there is also the education of professionals, journalists, policymakers, those working in tech who actually have to deal with this information environment and its evolution the whole time. I'm in the early stages of working up a university mid-career postgraduate program attempting to do just that. So I'm absolutely not blind to the problems of disinformation, far from it, but I would urge us all to think about what we can do, not what we can't do. But in the UK, we better get a move on. There has been really concerning Russian meddling and disinformation in elections in Moldova, in Romania, in Germany. It doesn't appear to have been a problem in last year's UK elections, unless my esteemed academic guests can tell me otherwise. But we just have to look at the fact that that wasn't close. Have a look at last week's by-election in Scotland, where just a few hundred votes stood between three major political parties. What if hundreds of constituencies across the country were that close in 2029? And what if disinformation meant hundreds of people in each of them were voting under false pretenses, swayed by manipulated information? I think that's a real plausible outcome, and I think it's pretty terrifying. So I would ask us to think practically about disinformation right now.
Thank you. Alexander.
Right, so when I think when we look at the scale of the problem, we have to start entertaining things that will seem fantastical, pie in the sky, not realistic at first. And so I'll end with some of those things, but the scale really is massive, right? We have disinformation that is the activity of state actors that are actively trying to destabilize our democracies. We have the consolidation of media into the hands of relatively few mega billionaires with personal agendas, and that's everywhere from the Washington Post, where Jeff Bezos from one day to the next says the editorial positions will change, and there are certain things you cannot talk about and certain editorials you cannot write. It's happening in France, where a very far-right billionaire from Bretagne, Vincent Bolloré, is purchasing media, CNews, Europe on Radio, Le Journal du Dimanche newspaper, and he has a very specific political project to promote the far right. And it's also a result of market forces. So David Colon, a professor at Sciences Po, estimates that about $10 billion a year in advertising revenue is connected with disinformation. And so when we think of the scale of that problem, I think we have to take the carrots approach, we have to take a sticks approach, and finally, if we can't beat them, maybe we have to own them. And so in terms of carrots, another initiative that sounds kind of like the Trust in News initiative is the Journalism Trust Initiative, which would be effectively a type of label, like organic labels on foods to help orient people as to where they can get reliable information. I think there's a lot of people who are just overwhelmed, and they're not exactly sure what information they can and cannot trust. There's a lot of accounts on TikTok, on Instagram, purporting to be news, and a lot of people follow them and are very misled by the things that they're encountering or the things that are being shared by their social circle, their network. And so applying some type of label, an account that's an official news account, or whether it's an individual influencer, people and organizations that are adhering to standard editorial newsroom practices maybe can get this label from this organization or potentially a public regulator that accredits it, and that could help orient people to where they need to go. This was really destructive when Musk took away the verification check, right, on Twitter, regardless of what problems there were with how do you get it and who gets it. It was a way of knowing that something was more trustworthy potentially than something without it. Not that an account without a check couldn't be trustworthy, but it was just an indicator of this is where I can potentially go. And so that's definitely a carrot model that we can follow. In terms of sticks, we do need regulation. The European Union has the Digital Markets Act. There are laws against hate speech. With sticks, we have to become much more ready to wield them, right? So whether the regulation is inadequate or not, I don't know if we can say, because we haven't seen a regulator really go at infringement on some of these regulations with big fines that can't be ignored. And so all the way to the point of banning X. I think the European politician who realizes, the way Mark Carney did, that there is huge political gain to be had by going head-to-head with Donald Trump and not backing down is going to reap massive rewards. Should the EU ban X? Yes. The same way that Donald Trump, has evoked at different moments, forcing TikTok to spin off its US operations to a US company, I think the EU should take a similar approach and go even further than that. If there is an absence in Europe of social media companies that operate at this scale, where they're able to really influence what reality people are being presented with via the algorithm, and they're not being homegrown in Europe, then maybe Europe should buy TikTok. Maybe Europe should buy Blue Sky, or say we're going to make a direct investment in Blue Sky in exchange for Blue Sky adhering to these set of European values and locating all of its servers on European territory. And so the one global actor that is still interested in upholding these principles of liberal democracy that can go toe-to-toe with the United States or China is the EU. If you adjust for purchasing power parity, Europe's GDP is slightly more than the US, a little over $30 trillion. The US is a little bit under $30 trillion. An economic war between those two sides would be devastating, but it would also destroy the US economy, right? So this is a situation of mutually assured destruction. So if the Trump administration reacts to the EU saying X is banned, Europe has instruments that it can use in response to that the United States also doesn't want to be confronted with. And so this brings me to the should we own them component. Public media, not that correlation equals causation, of course, but there is a lot of research that supports the conclusion that public media is something that results in people having more trust in institutions. 90% of European countries, and over 90% of European countries, the public broadcaster is the most trusted of the media present in that country. There's correlation between whether people are less susceptible to misinformation and the degree to which they consume public service media more than other types of media. And it's also correlated with funding. So in the Nordics, you have over 100 euros. Denmark, I think, is the lowest per capita spend. Norway is the highest with about 140 euros per capita spent on public media. It's really high. United States is less than 2 euros per capita on public media. And we can see the effects of which society is being racked with disinformation, huge swaths of people no longer adhering to not even a shared reality, but reality itself, and which countries are doing relatively better. And so the idea of bringing massive support to public media to a European level, I think, is something that the EU should absolutely also look at. And so maybe the thing that's still slightly American about me, even though I've spent the majority of my adult life now in France, is my relationship with big numbers, which I think are not shocking in a US context. They tend to be shocking in European contexts. I think the European Union should put 25, 30, 40 billion euros on the table and create a European public media fund, that boosts the average spend of European public media to sort of that 50 euros per capita, 100 euros per capita level in countries where that it's not reaching that level. Voters, people who consume media, when they think that the public media is independent, they're much more willing to trust it. So you also, by locating it at a European level, you get around some of the problems where the far right can take power in Poland or in Hungary, and they can immediately go after the public broadcasters as a way of shifting the message, cementing their power, promoting their own vision for society and how to change it. So I think, going from the scale of what can we do that's relatively realistic and small term, how can we really hit the regulations hard to make sure that companies are abiding by this, to things that don't seem realistic, but I think when you look at the history of the European Union recently, it seems like it's not going to do something until an inflection point is reached, and then it does. So common borrowing during COVID. Seemed like it was never going to happen, and then it happens. Massive defense spending. Who would have thought that Germany would be spending 500 billion euros in this massive campaign of rearmament, and then all of a sudden it happens. And so the idea that it might seem pie in the sky that Europe would go buy blue sky and put tens of billions of euros on the table to create public media alternatives or reinforce them might seem not realistic, but I think we're going to get to the point where we say, well, look, we're spending all this money on defense, but the war is also informational. And so why would we spend all this money on defense and not defend the ability of our democracies to function?
Thank you. That was really, really interesting, and the narrative art worked perfectly. I'm going to ask a few questions and then throw it over to you guys, because I'm imagining you have lots of questions. So start thinking, and there'll be mics coming around. None of you said it, but I'm inferring slightly that when we talk about Trump's empty core, and we talk about ownership, and we talk about billionaire classes, the volume of disinformation, how much do you see it actually pertaining to one agenda, which is the enrichment of the Trump family and other billionaire media owners, that the scale of disinformation has a purpose in plain sight, which is effectively financial corruption? When you look at the volume of turbulence in the stock market in relation to the introduction of tariffs, the withdrawal of tariffs, the reintroduction of them, Trump himself has said this is a great time to buy stock. I mean, how much more plain sight do we need? Is this really about the agglomeration of even more wealth to people who have so much wealth and power the rule of law is no longer, it's a barrier and a pain in the backside, and let's just pretend it doesn't exist?
Well, I think to start, I'd say I agree. I do agree that there is a component to this where we can see the personal enrichment of the MAGA project and the people within the MAGA project as a way of reinforcing their power, right? That we can see this as an attempt to solidify the positions of people involved. There's been a recent upsurge in attention paid to the personal stock trading of US senators and congresspeople, and I would encourage any of you to pay attention. If you do invest, there are now apps in which you can copy the trades of those senators and congresspeople because they statistically outperform the S&P every single year since records begin. And it is a pretty much guaranteed way of making a hell of a lot of money. Recently, Marjorie Taylor Greene has made a huge amount of money on trades with Palantir, a company who has recently benefited from some of the Doge projects and the ICE projects as well. So I'd say that there's a key part of it is to personally empower and enrich the projects, but I'd also say it's more broad than that. It's also the same kind of thing that we've seen arguably throughout most of modern political history. The use of othering, identifying some other against whom we can attach your focus as the people so that you're not looking our way when the richer people within society, the top 1%, the top 0.1%, are making ungodly amounts of money through their policies. Absolutely.
So it's distortion.
Yeah.
And I mean, if I can bounce off that, yeah, I think this is key, right? And these are deeply elitist projects. It's about wealth, but it's about power, it's about cementing it, it's about diverting attention. It's like, you know, if you're struggling right now, it's not because of the economic system we live in. It's not about because of us getting tax cuts, it's because of the other. And the other is generally formed for a moral panic, someone we don't know, we don't interact with. It could be immigrants, it could be minorities of various kinds and so on, what's called moral panics, right? And this is where I think we have really missed a trick in countering this kind of politics by accepting their discourse, by accepting their words. We call them populists. And by calling them populists, we link them to the people. Instead, we should call them elitist. They are deeply elitist. Trump does not care about the Rust Belt. He does not care about the working class. Farage doesn't care about the working class either. To be fair, few of our politicians care about the working class. And the working class has very little voice because the working class is very divided today. It's very diffuse. People misunderstand what it could be, see it as a cultural construction rather than an economic one. But we've allowed the far right to hijack it without us questioning it. We've given it to them, right? Even though, as I said before, if we look at electoral results, the working class, however you want to construct it, does not vote predominantly for Trump, predominantly for Farage, predominantly for Brexit, predominantly for Le Pen. Mostly the working class doesn't vote. Trump in 2016 defeated Clinton massively in the two highest income ranks. But Clinton did much better than Trump. Clinton, who was deeply, deeply unpopular, did much better than Trump in the two poorest segments of the population in the US. Biden did even better. And Trump did better against Biden with the wealthiest sections of society in 2020 than he had done against Clinton. This is a wealthy vote. Brexit is also a wealthy vote. It's been skewed by our misunderstanding of turnout, which has made us believe that actually the Brexit vote comes from the North, comes from the Red Wall and so on. No, that's not true. There are more votes in sheer number of votes that came from Scotland for Brexit that came from the north of England. It sounds surprising, right? Because we all know that Scotland voted predominantly for Remain. But in terms of sheer number of votes, which is what counts in a referendum, Scotland brought in more votes. And the place in England that brought in the most vote for Brexit was the southeast, right? Because it's more populated, there are more people. So all of these kind of things, we've allowed the far right to hijack. We've given it to them. We've accepted it by their word. And one of the things that's always, and I'll finish on that, I'm sorry I'm taking too long, but one of the things that I want to finish on this term populism, which to me has been a bugbear of mine, is that in 1991, Jean-Marie Le Pen, Marine Le Pen's father, who had created the Front National out of a neo-fascist alliance with Nazi collaborators and so on, in 1991 he was trying to push for the party to be called populist. Why was that? Because he didn't want to be called fascist. He didn't want to be called extreme right. He didn't want to be called racist. He didn't even want to be called nationalist. He wanted to be called populist. Why? Because it linked him to the people, and it's a lot less stigmatizing. And what have we done? We've given it to him.
There was a piece, I think it was yesterday, in the FT about American media enabling Trump and the kind of firing up of a populist. I mean, this is not new news. The 1930s, Lord Harmsworth, the founder of the Daily Mail, said you have to give the people something to hate every day. So in a sense, there's a long line of media enablement of far-right ideologies. Can the TNI survive in the current environment of a much closer MAGA relationship with big tech companies?
I guess the point that I was trying to make is about being modesty. I think that this is not the kind of answer to all the problems of disinformation. And I think that they are, as this panel has shown, it's multi-layered, and there are undoubtedly, as we've heard, issues with media concentration, and in some ways, the other thing that I think that we need to think about is the fact that you make money at the moment in the online environment that we have by pushing towards polarisation, emotional news, reductive solutions. That is how you maintain engagement with your audience online, because the longer they stay online, the more that they consume advertisements, and the more that's how you make money. And so I think you have to argue that whatever the proprietors may or may not want to do, and I'm not suggesting they don't have their own motives, there are also very strong financial motives to go in a particular direction, which means that you have to step right back and think, what are the bits that we can pick off and do, because the financial incentives and whatever the proprietors may or may not want to do are such huge topics. You've got to start by doing things you can do.
So two of you mentioned education, and of course education itself is under the most extreme hostile policy environment. The idea that billions of dollars can get taken away at the stroke of a pen from Ivy Leagues who seemed utterly impenetrable less than 2 months ago, Harvard, Columbia, et al. So the role of education is critical, but it itself is highly constrained in its ability or its willingness, in some cases, if you look at the Columbia situation, to actually go toe-to-toe with. Should we, I guess, from a UK perspective, UK universities are very much looking at what's going on in the US and thinking, this is a potential scenario we may face in the future. What, if anything, should US universities be doing to counter what's going on at the moment? Can they? In the context of, if education has a role to play in countering disinformation, how can it when essentially the systems and the structures are attacking the purveyors of education itself?
Up to you.
No, I was going to say, I think there is a fight back, and it's a fascinating process. Harvard has made a lot of their courses on civics and how American government works free, and they are promoting it with their enormous endowments to the entirety of the US population. They are using their clout and their weight very effectively. They are promoting the educational services that they provide on this exact media landscape, and why it might be of benefit to someone like Donald Trump to attack what he refers to as an elitist institution of education, which Harvard absolutely is, but why it might be beneficial to launch this kind of attack. And it is working. Uptick and uptake in these courses is enormous in a matter of days. And this is only expanding with more and more social media engagement. And I think this is something that a lot of universities can and should do, and actually are. I mean, we at York have our own Future Learn program, if you're ever interested in anything related to what we do. I've written one on how we can understand terrorism and climate politics in the modern era of crisis. We have one on the pubs of York and everything in between those two. So it's, exactly.
You Google MOOC on the university website and they're all free.
Yes, they're all free, and it's a useful way of getting that message out in a way that actually, in the case of American politics, is very difficult to counter. How do you counter someone providing a free, short education that is precisely focused in a purposeful way to counter this kind of narrative? I would say that it's also a matter of the kind of generational divide that's emerging in American politics as well. We have a fascinating relationship between gender and higher education and age and higher education in arguably the West, but also it's on steroids in America, right? That generally young men from a less economically well-off background are much more likely to see higher education or education of any form as feminine and as something that they should not wish to do and something that could actually harm them. Whereas women are generally from a similar social class, and actually from all social classes in the US at the moment, see higher education as the path to a higher income later on in life. And that is something that I think US institutions are aware of, but also have to be able to combat, that there isn't this gender divide, there is already a racialized divide, but this is something that has to happen, this fight against the development of alternative narratives around education, right? The idea that education could be harmful or not beneficial. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Very briefly, like I think there's a bigger issue here as well. I mean, I really agree with what you said, but the first universities that were targeted by Trump, if we go back, or by Trumpism, let's say, if we go back, if you think about Florida, for example, were particularly disciplines, arts, humanities, social sciences, that were critical, right? And why were they targeted first? Why was critical race theory banned in Florida? Why was gender studies banned in Florida? Because, well, they challenge these narratives. And so I think, what we need to do in mainstream society as well is not fall for the kind of argument that we just need to provide skills and STEM and invest in STEM and things like that. Because if we want vibrant democracies that are educated about information, about the media, about how to read the news, we need humanities, we need social sciences, we need these things. It's an investment, right? We were talking about it, I think, yesterday, and this investment, I think, in people, this investment in education, this investment in understanding democracy is crucial, and that worries me not just in the US under Trump, that worries me here today in the UK, right? And we're seeing these threats to various departments at the moment, and I think if we want a vibrant democracy, we need to protect these.
I absolutely agree.
I wonder if one of the potentially unforeseen impacts of AI is going to be that universities end up refocusing on their core mission. I think universities did a disservice to themselves and to the public at large and to the role of education in a society when they went heavily into come to university as a way to get a high-paying job and make a lot of money and advance your career. And you see stats, even at a place like Harvard, where students from really, really wealthy families will still get almost full coverage by Harvard's endowment to go there. You see that twice as many students say that what they want to get out of their education, their time at Harvard, is financial success. And half as many students will say something like develop a meaningful life philosophy or a worldview. And so if AI kind of savages white-collar careers, maybe universities will be forced to reposition themselves and say, well, you know what? We can get rid of our business school and we can still be a university. We can't necessarily get rid of philosophy and art history and literature and these other humanities subjects and still consider ourselves a university. So maybe they'll be forced by AI, like wreaking havoc in the white-collar world, to get back to what is education, how do we provide education that forms people in society and not just how do we form people as career advancers.
I think that's a really interesting point. I will say our business school is a school for business and society, so it is linked to social outcomes in a very explicit way. But I do think higher education is going through a massive scale of turbulence that it has not for maybe 2,000 years. I'm going to end on this point. I love the idea of organic journalism. I'm quite interested in the idea of alignments of organic education and organic journalism. But Alexander, your not so fantastical thoughts, are these being socialized in Europe? You live in Paris. Are these ideas real? Because it's very obvious the EU is the bulwark, which is why the MAGA movement seem to hate it so much. So how much can that kind of conversation happen?
From Paris, I mean, yes, the French have always wanted to have a more federal EU, an EU that is more statist in sort of very French ways. And so I think the interesting thing is how much the rest of the EU is coming around to some of these approaches that France was pushing for years, right? A European Defense Union, doing European joint borrowing. And some of this you can say it's France trying to get around the constraints of its large debt and get at spending money in a different way. But I think a lot of the approaches are bearing out when you see that actually maybe the United States wasn't such a reliable security partner. Maybe it's a hostile economic actor now. And so maybe the only way that Europe can survive with the types of societies we want to live in the world is by adopting this stronger, more federal, more state-centric approach to the EU, rather than having little individual countries try and go up against the Trump administration in very lopsided ways, as I think the UK is experiencing right now. And so is it becoming less pie in the sky? I think so. I think we're going to see, and Aurelien, maybe the EU will just be taken over by far-right forces. But I think we're going to see in the next few years some of these things move more into the realm of reality. And the more we talk about them, the Overton window, the more they do move into the realm of the conceivable. So.
Well, you heard it here at the York Festival of Ideas first. Jessica, did you want to come in on this point?
Very briefly. I think we have potentially, across Europe, you have something called the European Broadcasting Union, which is the equivalent of the BBC across all the countries. They've all been under massive financial strain for the last couple of decades, frankly, as their budgets have been cut. And I think in a world in which we need to have places of absolute veracity, maybe their moment has come. Rather than reinventing a set of new institutions, you can build on some of the institutions that exist already and were set up, for the most part after the Second World War, deeply embedded in values.
Well, you had just, sorry, but to piggyback on that, right?
Yeah.
When you had the Trump administration sort of decimate funding for Radio Liberty, Radio for Europe, you had the Czech government step in and say, wait a minute, because of our experience in the Cold War, we understand the value of this and we're going to try and take up the funding of it. So yes, exactly.
I mean, perhaps the way to think about this is to align everyone's newly emerging urgent defence strategies with the arm of investment in trusted media platforms to kind of link those two things together. Mark Lacey, who some of you are regular attenders of the Morale Day, and you will remember Mark in 2016 talking about the fact that NATO was unable to deal with the industrial scale of troll farms from Russia, which is probably even much larger now than it was in 2016. So perhaps the linking of those two things together might be sensible.
I mean, sorry, I don't want to sort of... I mean, I firmly believe, on the one hand, two things which appear incompatible. On the one hand, you cannot have governments controlling media, because then they are not free media.
Yeah.
However, in the rising instability that we now face, you absolutely need to realise that information is on the front line, and well-funded independent media in an area of market failure is really important.
It's again fascinating how the multi-layered approach that you talked about before, because you could just have public media, but then if it's hijacked by a far-right government, then as we were discussing before, so you need all these kind of like safeguards that make it properly independent as well. So it needs to be public, but it needs to be local, but it also needs to be tied together, as you were saying, with education, right? Because you need also people to be able to access it, to have the time to access it, to have the facilities, all of this kind of thing. So it can't just, there's no magic bullet, right? There's not an easy way. It's not just investing just in media. We need to invest in our societies. And what worries me is at the moment, the investment going only into the military.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, what kind of Europe are we going to defend if our democracy crumbles, right? Is this what we want?
Piggyback on that, I'd also say information is arguably going to be the first area of conflict between, the EU, the West, and other actors who are seeking to undermine it, right? That we have had, in the Strategic Defence Review, people have already come out to say that Russia is in effect already at war with the West and already at war with the United Kingdom. And talking about NATO being under attack. Speaking to people in NATO, that is now more than hourly.
Yeah.
Every single hour they are under a fundamental attack from bot farms, from cyber farms, and it is a fundamental part of what they are doing in a way that has never really been conceived of. And I think that artificial separation of information and defence or warfare, that has to be gotten rid of. Those two things have to be integrated. We have to have a secure society in terms of our understanding of what reality is to be able to defend that reality.
Okay, well, that seems like a very good moment to throw it out to the audience. I'm going to ask you to reflect over the next 25 minutes. I'm going to ask each of you to end on one thing that gives you some hope. So,
That's not what I do.
So you can be pondering on that. So we've got roving mics, so please wait for them because there'll be people using hearing loops. I've got a lady right down here, Oliver, so don't fall, but... And I might take 2 questions at a time because I find we get round more questions. So we'll take your question. You can do anything you want within reason.
Disinformation and polarisation continue to be key factors in the perpetuation of the genocide in Gaza and the undermining of international rule of law, namely the workings of the ICC and the ICJ. What can we do to ensure the human rights of the Palestinian people are protected? And I hope that next year's Festival Ideas can address this vital issue in depth.
Thank you. I think there was a question up here. Yep.
The panel's alluded to this, but not mentioned explicitly, in terms of, I think, the growing rise of inequality across a number of countries is a contributory factor to the rise of disinformation. And governments don't seem to be, or public service broadcasters, sorry, don't seem to be reflecting that. Do you think that's true?
Okay, should we deal with this lady's question first? I mean, we have covered Middle Eastern issues pretty frequently in the festival, but in terms of disinformation in relation to that.
Well, I mean, I would absolutely agree, right, that this is a key part of how we can see information being used within conflict and as an area of conflict, right? That there is an attempt at constructing a different reality in a different way than we would maybe see in the UK or in other matters or other topics, but it is still a way of managing information in a way to perpetuate and to solidify conflict. And I think the solutions that we can propose, I think the major thing that we have to do is to push more of our governments to actually confront this issue, actually talk about this issue, and actually stand up to some of the narrative coming out of this extreme right-wing Israeli government, right? So saying that actually we are going to press as many of our MPs as we possibly can in a coordinated manner. This is happening, but it needs more power to it, it needs more weight to it, more voices to it, and actually saying that we are not going to accept some of the narratives that come through in our British media, especially when we're discussing the conflict, right? So the number of times we'll have an Israeli spokesperson come onto the news and their narrative will be accepted to a far greater degree than would typically happen for any other actor. Actually, can we have some of that critical journalism coming back through? And actually some of the fear surrounding the topic is arguably going to be a key part of this, right? It is a conflict that is incredibly difficult to talk about, and we shouldn't shy away from that. It's an incredibly difficult topic to talk about. I teach a course here on terrorism and counter-terrorism. I was mid-lecture on how counter-terrorism can be conducted and has been conducted when October the 7th happened. Now, that's an incredibly difficult topic to be discussing, and actually, it's incredibly difficult regardless of any other conflicts that come through. But it's something that we have to consider. Our sensitivity to discussing it is a key factor in how we maybe accept different narratives, or maybe we don't push back against a maybe lack of critical journalism. So I think pushing our broadcasters, public, private, whoever, but also pushing our politicians to not accept some of the narratives that come through and actually help give voice to the alternative narratives is crucial.
Yeah, very briefly, I mean, thank you for bringing this up. I think it's been a massive mainstream failure here. And I think that has done a lot of damage. We've talked a lot about Trump today, about disinformation and all of this, but I think the reaction to what happened on October 7 and since the reaction as well in our government, in our media, has been an incredible failure and has played right in the hands of Trump, of the far right, of reactionaries and so on, because yeah, I mean, why would they respect the international order when we don't respect it? You know, we've talked a lot about Trump, about the crackdown on universities and things like that, but what's been happening in Germany is absolutely horrifying. You know, I have colleagues in German universities who are scared to talk, who are scared to be there, particularly if they're not German themselves. This is the engine of Europe, of the EU, right? And this is what we are going to be relying on to counter the disinformation from Trump, from Putin and so on. And I think, I think it has been a huge mistake. I think the tide is turning slowly, but I think it's done a massive disservice to democracy. It's done a massive disservice to the rule of law. It's done a massive disservice to, justice. So yeah, thank you for bringing it up.
Okay, and the other question?
What was the other? Sorry.
It was more about that if you're at the bottom of the pile, then you're more likely to be susceptible to disinformation. And as far as I don't see it, public service broadcasters aren't really reflecting the world that they see, so they are more likely to be susceptible to disinformation. Do you think there's a role for public service broadcasters to play in reflecting the world around them a bit more?
Absolutely. Of course. I mean, yes. It's the job of public service broadcasters to reflect and be self-critical about making sure that they reflect the world around them. I guess I'm trying to sort of understand your framing of, is your argument that they don't see the full world around them and therefore, yeah.
Well, inequality is growing, so it's kind of like, because and the likes of the Washington Post will reflect that. So people need to kind of see a bit more of the world around them as they see it, because otherwise they'll be susceptible to disinformation and lies and the like.
Absolutely. I mean, it's incredibly important for all news organisations to reflect the world in which they live, and the fact that there is a lot less money in media than there used to be means that the most expensive job, which is going out and talking to people, becomes something that there just is less of. But, it's incredibly important to work out how you can counter that, because AI can help you with a whole load of things, and a lot of media are brilliant in becoming more efficient by using AI, and personally I think that's a very good thing. What they obviously can't do, and never should do, is replace that with on-the-ground reporting and really understanding people that they don't necessarily go to first.
This is why it's really expensive to run a newsroom and to have people on the ground, right? And so also in response to your question, I would love to see the media do more in terms of putting front and center Palestinian journalists, who are writing from Gaza. Maybe we should be translating things more frequently than we're translating things, and featuring that. But it is really expensive to run a newsroom that operates with correspondents on the ground in different places around the world. And so funding is really, really crucial, right? Like, there are a handful of newspapers and news organizations that really have that type of global reach. And the New York Times, the Washington Post, a bit before Bezos kind of reoriented it, The Guardian, Le Monde, they're there, but they're not that many that really have the resources to do that kind of thing. And so that's...
And it's exacerbated by the lack of funding for local media. So you have the vacuum at both the top and the bottom.
Right, and so when you hollow out the local media, then then the job for sort of global national media becomes even more difficult to do and to accomplish. And then, but just one more point on sort of rising inequality, because I think this ties back into social media and the way that it shapes our worldviews. In terms of the Anglo-Saxon world, yes, right? Inequality is huge in the United States, rising in other places. It's not actually rising to the same extent everywhere, right? Like in France, by Gini coefficient, inequality today is less than during the Trente Glorieuses, which is the period of economic growth that the French want to return to. But it had much higher inequality than France does today by Gini coefficient. So I think also the algorithms behind these social media networks and the reality of most of the accounts with huge followings being from the United States, being from the UK, but being centered in this sort of English-speaking transatlantic space distorts the conversations that other people are having about their own societies. And in ways that it's happening, inequality is growing. It has grown in France under Macron's presidency, but it has not grown in the same way that it has in the United States. The United States is a deeply, deeply unequal country, much more so than France.
I think it's also about how we as in like, people who have the opportunity to talk about, like we're journalists, academics again, politicians, how we talk about the people who don't have a voice, right? Who don't have an easy voice because of a lack of access, because of the uneven kind of playing field that we are talking about in public discourse. And unfortunately, when we talk about people who are at the bottom of a socioeconomic ladder, we talk about these people generally in a very stereotypical way. We're going to talk about the white working class, for example, instead of talking about the working class more broadly and how diverse it is really in our societies. We're going to get some kind of caricature, someone telling us something that we expect, because also we are generally not part of these communities. And I think that's a big problem, because it links to the problem of having enough money to do it, but also to the engagement. And the local news, I think, is absolutely crucial here, because you need people who live in these communities to be able to talk about these communities, rather than someone coming from London, to the north for like 2 hours and doing a little vox pop and finding someone who says something shocking so that we can get a reaction, right? So I think there's a massive problem there, because I think what we're seeing in the news is not necessarily representative of these communities. We're not seeing the solidarity. We're not seeing people struggling, but still trying to kind of, keep communities going, so.
Right, I'm going to take another round of questions. There's a lady down here and a lady up there. So we'll take you from the top because you've got the microphone, and we'll take you second.
Okay, thank you. It's been really, really interesting. Aurelien, I take your point about voter turnout being part of the issue. And as a Belgian, I used to feel really smug. We have compulsory voting, and I thought, that's fine, we're safe. Oh, no, we're not. I still think it's a good thing, and I'm still in favour of it, but it's clearly not the entirety of the solution. And as a European in the UK, I am in pro-EU circles, and what I see a lot is what you mentioned, that smugness of, we didn't fall for it, we know better, we're educated. And I find it infuriating, but it also makes me think, well, surely the other side don't go, oh, we're disinformed, that's right. They also think they're informed. They also think they're educated and that they know better. So how should people who think they are informed and, objectively so, communicate with the other side in a way that isn't smug, that isn't condescending, that doesn't insult their intelligence, because that's clearly counterproductive?
Brilliant. We'll take the lady down here.
Yes, because the topic of this discussion is polarization, I just have noticed that all of you several times have used the term far right. I haven't heard the term far left mentioned even once. So I would like to hear a little bit of balance back from you that, what is the damage or the benefit or whatever from saying far left or far right? And ultimately, is it the most damaging thing of all for us to have labels on either side, which I think in some cases creates the polarization and decreases the chances of us having civil debate in our society?
Right, okay. Let's take compulsory voting. Interesting idea, but smug middle-class people. It's one of the reasons we set up a festival of ideas that didn't have university branding, just to try to reach audiences who think we're smug. Who wants to take the idea of how to bridge the divide? Because Matt alluded to it in his opening framing as well.
I'm happy to talk to you. We know from research that if you simply tell people that they're wrong, they will ignore you, which is sort of probably a statement of the bleeding obvious. What's increasingly happening is that disinformation is about manipulated debates and inorganic and inauthentic debates. but they must have people who feel that at least there is a kind of kernel of truth. So in a way, you have to get to some of the issues that we've been talking about, which is why do people feel the underlying issues that they're talking about in the way they do. And then there's a sort of technical bit in the way that we've heard, which says, actually, this person telling you something isn't the person they say they are. And it's sort of a bit more subtle. So it's understanding why people come from some of the positions they do. And I totally agree with the lady over here. I haven't used the word far right because I agree with you. I think polarisation of all kinds is really toxic and really unhelpful, and we need to find why people, even if we disagree with it, are coming to the positions that they're coming to. And then I think there are technical solutions to say, actually, that person telling you that isn't the person they're doing. Interestingly, the Agence France Presse, during the Gilets jaunes protests, whenever it was, 3 or 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, found that in those big Facebook groups, there were a lot of people talking about, there were a lot of conspiracy theories that were going round. And they found that their role, interestingly, was often people would come out of those and say, actually, there's a fact going round. Is that actually true? And then there would be a way in which they'd ask Agence France Presse, and they would either say, yes, it is, or it might be a bit, or it's completely wrong. So it's a kind of more subtle thing than saying, you're wrong and these people are right.
I want to kind of disagree with you a little bit on the use of the term far right. There is a far left, and I think the far left in different places has an anti-Semitism problem, for example. And I think that the far left in the United States went too far into the idea of who has ownership over what and who can speak about what topic and in what space. But the difference is that the far right has political power. So on the far left, you're talking about literally culture, cancel culture. And on the far right, you're talking about the use of state legislatures to go after what books are in school libraries and literally what topics are being taught in classrooms, what words are banned for academics who are applying for grant funding, including women, politics. I don't know how you're supposed to do any research if you're located in the United States with that. And so I think the US media has done a really bad job of covering Trump. And I'll put out this example. The double standard around the word lie and the word joke. The New York Times, multiple instances, will say Donald Trump joked about something. They won't use the word lie because they say we can't project into his head and know his inner thoughts. Well, then you can't know that he's joking either, right? So, like if the headline, and the headlines are a problem too. Lots of people just scroll headlines. So when the New York Times puts Trump brazenly combated in press conference, when the headline should be Donald Trump lies from the Oval Office, that is a problem.
I think again, yeah, this is very important, right? It's absolutely key, right? Terminology is absolutely key. I mean, I use far right because I research with far right. I have a very precise definition, the same way other scientists have precise definitions of what they research. So I'm not using this term in an incendiary way. I'm using this term based on a very clear definition that matches the actors I'm talking about, right? We could talk about the far left, but I mean, as you said, Alexander, the far left has very little power today. Also, cancel culture, I think I would be very careful with because it's been massively over-egged as a moral panic that has been exaggerated. You can still say lots of things. I mean, look at our media. You know, our media always tells us, you can't talk about immigration anymore. Immigration was the second most talked about topic during the Brexit referendum, right? And it was the most on the front page, and it was always, almost always in a negative manner. So we can talk about immigration. We can talk about lots of things, but what's fascinating is what you can't talk about is the other side, is the people we are talking about in that manner, but we don't hear at all. So who has power here? Is it immigrants? Is it trans people? Is it the culture warriors on academic campuses in the US? Or is it actually the media, who is mostly owned by billionaires today, who are deciding, you know, what we're seeing, what we're hearing? So I think this is very important, and terminology really, really matters. Just very briefly on compulsory voting, I certainly wasn't advocating that we should force people to vote at all. I think it's not necessarily a terrible idea in and of itself, but if people vote but they don't know what they're voting for and they don't have a stake in it and they don't have a debate about it and they're not proud of what they, or not proud, but they're not convinced by what they're voting for, then we have a dysfunctional democracy. Of course, you will never be able to vote for whatever kind of utopia you have in your mind, but at least you should be voting for something you believe in. And this is less and less the case, unfortunately, for good or bad. And I think that's the issue. So the problem is not just that we need to force these people who are not turning up to vote, but to understand why they're not turning up and not look at them dismissively the same way you were talking about. Because when we think about people who abstain, we think about them as failing democracy, as being lazy, as being uneducated, all these kind of things. No, lots of people are not voting because they feel the voting system doesn't work for them. And to be fair, it's really hard to blame them quite often, right? Because the people who vote the least are the people who are at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder and young people. And yeah, politicians don't talk to them. So, fair play.
Well, I think I'd also draw a link between, I think, the gentleman's question here and the two more recent questions as well, and say actually there's a certain element of looking at the kind of why, right? Looking beyond maybe the moral panic or the conversation around the moral panic or the principles that are being expressed that I would say I associate with the far right. I wouldn't necessarily come to someone and say, you're far right, now let's have a conversation. I'm probably going to get punished. But what I will say is, okay, why is this something that bothers you so much? What is it behind this, panic about trans athletes in American high schools? One law in Florida essentially banned a single girl, trans girl, from being able to compete. She's the only person who is impacted by that law. You have spent tens upon thousands of taxpayer dollars in Florida to stop one person playing not very good baseball, to be perfectly honest. Fine, but is that really where we need to go? What is it behind that is the motivation? What's the why? Why do you believe this? Where does this come from when it comes to immigration? Is it about fairness? Is it about the distribution of certain access points or resources within society? How can we go beyond these claims around, immigrants are all coming over here taking our jobs? They're not. They're taking some jobs, but not necessarily yours. Where is this coming from? Right? Immigrants cause, crime. Statistically, that is absolutely not true. Sorry. Some do, obviously. I'm sure they do. But we domestic Brits cause a hell of a lot more crime. Where is this coming from, and where can we get to? So can we question some of the principles and look at the why? Why are you believing these things? Why are you maybe believing some of the ideas? And how can we have a meaningful conversation around those ideas or those feelings rather than the moral panics or the out there claims? And maybe that's where we can go away from some of the smugness as well, hopefully.
Okay, we are nearly at the end of the session, but we can carry on conversations in the breaks, and there will be more opportunities in the next session. I posed a question to you all, because it's in, kind of Sunday morning. Let's try and cheer ourselves up a little bit, possibly. Mm-hmm. Let me start with you, Chris. Is there anything that gives you hope in this space?
Yes, I would say that the project that we see in terms of MAGA, in terms of the American far right and Donald J. Trump, would be something that is unraveling in a way that maybe we didn't think would be, right? That this first 100 days has had more of an impact than his other first 100 days, but actually it's already starting to unravel. The opposition to it, the fractures within the movement are becoming more and more clear. The kind of anti-woke MAGA crowd is more and more disjointed from the anti-immigrant and the anti-other far-right crowd within the MAGA movement. So I think there is a beginning of the fracturing. I will qualify it because all my lectures are pessimistic. Deal with it. That we don't see a very effective opposition from the Democrats, but who knows? That might come from somewhere.
Lord, I hope they don't have to come in, your lectures aren't time for a Monday morning.
No.
Aurelien.
I think I'm traditionally even more pessimistic than you are, but still, I'll try my best. Now, what always gives me hope in all of this is that it's all contingent. Things don't have to be this way, right? The societies we live in don't have to be organized in this manner. They weren't always organized in this manner. They don't always have to be organized in this manner. What also gives me hope, to an extent, is that despite the power they have, the money they have, the wealth, the lack of resistance that they faced, these projects, these far-right projects, as I call them, they're still not that popular, right? They're popular enough sometimes to win elections, but by and large, they are not drawing in crowds. There's still a massive amount of the population in various countries that is still not sold to it or resisting it. However, they don't have a project to support instead. And I think that's the problem. But I think my hope is really the contingency. Things don't have to be this way. They only are this way because we let them be this way.
Okay, Jessica.
I think there are some really important movements in media. For me, if you're worried about disinformation, really good, strong media is the answer, and local media is the most important media of all. It's been decimated in the last few years, but what you're now seeing in this country and in America, and in fact around the world, are really innovative attempts to rebuild local media, make it sustainable, make it popular, and ultimately that is where a re-engagement with trusted media and fighting disinformation is going to happen, and we can see the green shoots already.
Excellent. Alexander.
I'll end with plugging The Guardian. So in September 2023, The Guardian launched a Europe edition with the goal of treating Europe as its own thing, not as sort of international news under the UK edition. And as the latest that I've heard, it's the second most read edition, so even ahead of Guardian Australia and Guardian US. So there's clearly a hunger for good journalism that meets people where they are.
Okay, well, I just want to say an enormous thank you. That was a really wide-ranging conversation. We didn't all agree, which is always good for a festival of ideas. Thank you so much for spending a Sunday morning. I'm sure you have many, many other things you could have been doing. So I'm really, truly grateful to all of you for coming to York and sharing your brilliant expertise and insight with our audience. So if we could just thank our panelists in the normal way. And there are two further brilliant panels with another round of fantastic speakers. The next one is really drilling into foreign policy, trade, tariffs, all the good stuff, and the one after that is European security. So do stick around. The cafe's open all day, lots of books to buy, and thank you all for being a brilliant audience.